Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of Insight. And Insight today we are going to talk about the outcome of the Asian Development Bank meeting. This meeting was organized. This was the 46th annual general meeting of the ADB. This was hosted by India. And interestingly, some very important points came out of this meet. Important will be to see that the lending rates, the lending by ADB is going to be around $10 billion and $6 billion will be going to India over the next 3 years. Also, the Prime Minister made certain assurances about boosting investment in the country and also ensuring a very handsome growth rate in the coming years. We look into all these aspects in this edition of Insight. And we are joined by Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. He's associated with the Jindal School of International Studies. Now, Dr. Chaulia, India has called upon ADB to invest more in the Asia-Pacific region. And important is we have, in fact, in the last segment, we talked about the constraints that we have. And of course, the ADB also warned India against the other, the financial problems that, globally the countries are facing, and the ADB is also not untouched by that. But how do you really look at, the way India has put forth the things and, of course, the lending part that has really emerged out of this meeting?
Yeah, I mean, these kind of forums are primarily platforms where we try to woo greater investment. And the ADB historically has been very strong in infrastructure finance. Because if you go back in time, 1960s, the Japanese created this because they had so much surplus capital, and they were looking for ways and means to generate businesses for their corporations. And the only way it could happen within our region was if infrastructure was boosted. So that's clearly one area where we will benefit a lot from ADB investments. I think overall, if you look at it, as was mentioned before, we probably are better than some of these other economies insofar as having greater social power and voice in these projects goes. ADB itself has been criticized often for not subscribing to the highest environmental standards in many of its projects. And of course, the emphasis on equity and equality is good now because high growth in this Asian region is generating also high levels of inequalities. And China is, of course, much more unequal than we are. So it will be important for the multilateral bodies like these to set some standards that are mutually agreed and shared by all the member states, and which can become norms which will generally follow. And to that extent, the change in the Japanese government has been very critical in the ADB's direction. Because Abenomics are the sense of Japanese corporations which will then want to come out and look for profitable places to invest. So I think there is an opportunity here where we should be able to capitalize on it. Of course, I mean we tend to be defensive about it because often people are criticizing us that we are not business friendly, we are not investor friendly, we have too much red tape and corruption and so on. So it is a fact that our inward FDI flows have pretty much dried up. So that is a matter of concern. We will try to allay their worries. But remember, ADB is a kind of organization I think we would be more comfortable with, relatively speaking, compared to the World Bank, where our weightage and our voice and our shares are really minimal. But ADB, if you look at it, China and India roughly have 5% each of voting share, weighted voting, proportional voting shares. So that makes us a little more comfortable with this. This is not an American vehicle. Japan is in our neighborhood. We also need Japan strategically because we have concerns about China. And remember, ADB in the past has done things for India going against Chinese interests. The Chinese had objected to loans that we had received from the ADB, which they claimed was making a political statement about India's control over territories that China contested. So this is the kind of organization, relatively speaking, where we will be much more comfortable receiving aid. Although in general, I tend to oppose our overall attitude of going out with a bowl in hand and asking people when we talk about being an emerging power and a rising power. There is an issue, of course, of we are not able to tap our domestic savings and channel them into our own investments, right? So we are so dependent on foreign inflows. That's been a structural problem. And until we overcome that, unfortunately, we will remain dependent to some extent. But as I said, this dependence is preferable to the one of the IMF and the World Bank, because this is within our own region, and it's happening in the context where we are also looking at regional integration within our area. And there are all these currency swap agreements going on. There is a proposal for a comprehensive preferential trading agreement involving all our countries, with China at the helm in the driving seat. So all these initiatives can be underpinned by the ADB. And because Americans are not very influential in this organization, there's less of a tension that comes to whatever we do in this organization.
Right.
So I feel like it's a more harmonious group. Sometimes too harmonious to the point the Japanese bureaucracy has a particular style of running this organization, and it has received flack for it as well. But hopefully the change of the leadership within Japan and in the bank will lead towards different kinds of priorities. The emphasis on equity is new because if you look back in time, ADB has always been talking more or less like a junior partner of the World Bank and the IMF, and they have not really emphasized the social side very much. So although they have their audits and all those things before they grant loans, it's never reached the point where, so the emphasis on empowerment is fresh. If it is taken to its logical end, it will mean that people should have greater say. Although, as Siddharth mentioned, it should not become an impediment to speedy implementation of projects. I wanted to quote Curtis Chin, who is the former US ambassador to the ADB. He says, Asia is moving faster than the ADB. There are so many private capital flows. I mean, 10 billion, it is useful. But if you think about China's overseas development...
There are other interesting and ambitious projects also that we've been planning. That is, one of them is, of course, the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, which costs about $90 billion, over that, in fact. And that's where we're expecting ADB's support in such industrial corridors. But how important do you think is the phenomenon of regional cooperation and integration? Since Dr. Raju was also talking about eliminating the trade barriers, ensuring that it happens, and maybe by that these countries can really, ensure development of equal level.
I think the global economic crisis has forced a new kind of pattern, which can be called deglobalisation, which is basically there's already decoupling. We've already mentioned how Asia is growing at a clip of 6% when the OECD economies are around 1%. On average. So already we are seeing that capital and economic activity concentrates around more dynamic regions, and it is a fact that Asia is relatively speaking still booming, even though it's been slowing down. So what this means is that the inflows are increasingly going to come into our region. How are they going to be distributed? Are they going to be allocated as per the most efficient use of capital? These are issues where we will need some coordination at the multilateral level. We cannot just leave it to how open a particular individual economy is. So that's where regionalism is going to matter a lot. Like for example, our needs of infrastructure are way above what the Chinese have, because Chinese have already built it. In fact, there is they have overdone it in many ways. There are all these boondoggles. So we will need some degree of coordination on this, and that's where I think I see a bank playing a more critical role. But overall, regionalism, regionalism is driven, since Japanese, interestingly, who are of course the leaders of the ADB, have always thought about creating our own neighborhood type institutions. If you go back to the 97-98 Asian financial crisis, the Japanese were the first ones to propose an Asian monetary fund, because they were so upset with what the IMF had done. And they said that it had not met our needs and had been very insensitive and had this cookie cutter model, which failed and actually increased the crisis when through their by the advice of keeping the economies open for movement of capital. Malaysia was the only one which defied the IMF and actually fared better. So the Japanese have been always at the forefront of thinking about Asian solutions and Asian. In fact, going back even before World War II, they had a militaristic version of it. Now it's an economic one. And the Abenomics that I mentioned, the Japanese policy right now, it is looking at also new countries in our region like Myanmar that are emerging from long decades of economic deprivation and dictatorship. And our ADB is becoming a vehicle through which Japan can also make a huge foray into Myanmar. So India will have to play a lead role also in thinking about how we can leverage our position as a dominant player in Asia to solve and to overcome some of these crises in our neighborhood. So poverty, yes, also nation building and reconstruction of many societies. ADB is the way and the means through which our region can actually succor some of our own basket cases. We have quite a few in our region, even though the overall growth rate is good. So we will need to look at some of those weaker economies, concentrate on them, and India must take a lead within the ADB to push for the overall upliftment of the entire region.
Dr. Chaulia.
The phrase Asian century has been bandied about quite a bit. Asian Development Bank probably sits right in the center. It's one of the few pan-Asian organizations that brings together many of our sub-regions: East Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, barring the Middle East, which in India we call West Asia. Everybody else is there. So if this is the the engine of global growth for the future, ADB will remain relevant, and India will, of course, will need to think about other means by which we raise our salience in world institutions. But ADB is showing leadership, initiative, new proposals. This is the way forward for the global economy, for us to show that we have taken a responsible lead within this dynamic region.
Okay, so on that note, it's time here to thank all of you. Thank you very much for talking to us and joining us in this discussion. That's all we have for you in this edition of Insight. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.